From the Ear to There Travel Studio, this is the Ear to There Disney Podcast.
The Ear to There Podcast, it's time to start the show. Be sure to hold on tight, here we go. Exploring all the different Disney destinations. Ear to There, it's time to start the fun.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ear to There Disney Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Gramlich. I am also the owner and the founder of Ear to There Travel, which is a Disney specialized travel agency. It's my job, along with all of the vacationeers on the Ear to There Travel team, to take away all the stress, all the anxiety, and all that time that it takes to plan a Disney trip so you can focus on the really fun things like having a phenomenal time with your family and friends and enjoying the magic. Listen, this is going to be important moving forward, especially with no one really knowing when the parks will open, how the parks will open, what they'll look like, what will be open, what will be closed, what the social distancing will look like, all of that stuff. It'll really help you to have one of us in your corner helping you plan your next trip. Whether it's to Walt Disney World, Disneyland, the Disney Cruise Line, Adventures by Disney, Aulani, you name it, we all have the experience. We can all do it. And I really think now more than ever, you're going to need that extra help. Oh, and did I mention our services are free? Here's something I get all the time, right? And I'm going to get to the show. I am in a minute. But the cost you pay if you book a trip directly through Disney on the Disney website, that price that you get, even a discounted price, has a Disney travel agent's commission built into it. It's already covered. So if you don't use a free Disney specialized travel agent, that money just goes to Disney. But you're paying it either way, right? It's already being paid out to somebody. Let it be one of us or another travel agency. Do your homework. Make sure they're reputable. Make sure they're good. If for one reason or another you don't want to use Ear to There Travel, you don't want to use me or one of the vacationeers on my team, use another Disney specialized agency. Because listen, the travel industry is going to need it. We need it. And if you book with a travel agency or an agent, you can help the industry come back just a little bit at a time. So head over to ear2theretravel.com today. Get your free, no obligation quote. Contact and meet any of the vacationeers on the Ear to There Travel team. Send me a message. I get them all. I respond to them all. And you can also find this podcast. You can download the shows or you can listen straight on the website. Again, that website is www.ear2theretravel.com. All right, moving forward, last week I had the awesome opportunity to talk to my friend, Disney legend, Imagineer extraordinaire, the one, the only Mr. Bob Gurr. Now, it's been a while since Bob and I talked, and we had a bunch of questions, but I only had an hour. So I tried to get to as many of your questions as we could. We're going to talk again in a couple weeks and do the same thing. And I'm going to play his answer to one question only each and every episode from here on out. And I think it's been about 6 months since he last answered a question on the show. So if you don't know who Bob Gurr is, I'm going to explain it to you right now. Bob was hired by Walt Disney himself in 1954. He had over 200, I think it's around 250 projects that he worked on in the Disney company. He designed and built things like the Matterhorn, the monorail. Yes, it was the first monorail here in the Western Hemisphere. The Autopia, the Omnimover system, which includes attractions like the Haunted Mansion and Finding Nemo's Submarine Adventure. He built the Main Street vehicles. He built the fire engine. He built the omnibus. Listen, I could talk for another 25 minutes about what Bob created, what he invented, what he built in Disneyland and Walt Disney World. But I want to get to the question, and I want to get to the What About Bob segment of the show. This What About Bob segment is brought to you by the Waltland Bus Tour. When the quarantine is over, Bob will once again resume the bus tour, where he takes a busload of Disney fans around Southern California with stops in Los Angeles, in Burbank, and in Glendale. You'll see all kinds of sites in the history of the Disney company, but more importantly, you'll see personal sites that have to do with its founder, Walt Disney. To get tickets once the quarantine is over, you can go over to www.waltland.com. All right, without further ado, here is the man who was once a crash test dummy, and you'll find out why on this episode, Disney legend Bob Gurr.
It's What About Bob, Bob Gurr the legend.
Were you? I've read conflicting reports on this. Were you the original test dummy, I guess to say, on the Matterhorn, or was it somebody else?
No, the stories have been completely distorted all over it because the only photograph of record was with the temporary test car that Aero Development put together, which was not the production design that I did, that they eventually built, and the fact that photographers usually took pictures of executives, not workers. And there's one guy that was in a suit. I can't remember the guy's name, but that was a few days later. They had him ride it for publicity purposes. So then when you have a photographic record with the name of a person and it's done with the official company photographers using these big old speed graphic cameras, that then becomes the history. But I get that story all the time. I see the picture all the time, so I get the question all the time. What happened was there was a great rush to get that track finished, and we'd only finished the track on the west side down to just before it was going to go in the water. Because what this meant was we had the substantial part of the track outside the major business vertical building columns that hold up the building. So it was time that we put some sandbags in the car, and then we would run it up the chain lift. And then when the car would come running down the hill, we had hay bales out there, and the guys would grab it and try to catch it before it stopped in a kind of a low spot before it went in the water. So we'd started doing a couple of runs with the sandbags, and I think on the second day, I was down there with my little boy, and my boss, Roger, was there, who doesn't say much. He said, "Robert, you design it, you ride it." And I didn't want to. I had my little 6-year-old boy with me, a 7-year-old boy. But they took the sandbags out, and I had to get in the car with him. And so we had to start the car at another spot because we had a test car, move it over there because the track wasn't complete. And we went up, and it was a wild, rough ride because a lot of construction debris was all over the track. So it would bang around, made a big racket. It was shaking the daylights out of me. And it came down, and the guys all grabbed the car because the weight wasn't any different than the sandbags. So the performance was the same. Then I find out a few minutes later, the guys are laughing their heads off. Well, what's going on here? I was kind of a overly serious guy, and a lot of workers are jokesters. And I guess Roger, I think, is the guy that did it, made a comment. Well, we've got Gurr right where we want him. Pull the hay bales out. Yeah, so that first ride was that kind of jocularity going on. But I never rode it again until it was complete. But shortly thereafter, they had an executive with the company photographers and the publicity writers, and that's how the history got developed.
Thank you so much to Bob for answering the question. And I would thank the person who submitted it, but I actually think I submitted that question. So thank you to me. All right, if you have a question for Bob, you can email it to me. That email address is phil@ear2theretravel.com. And let's move on to the show. And I realized I don't think I recorded the intro. So this is episode number 201 for the week of May 25th, 2020. Now grab a drink. You know what? Let's scrap that this week. Instead, let me just say, ready when you are, CB.
Action! That's Hooey Valley, Hooey Hollywood, where any office boy or young mechanic can be a panic with just a good-looking pan. And any barmaid can be a star maid if she dances with or without a fan. Hooray for Hollywood, where
The idea for this episode started as a Word of the Week show. I was just going to do 15 minutes on the Great Movie Ride, the history, the background, and all that. And then I actually spoke to some friends, some former and current cast member friends who worked on the Great Movie Ride. Well, worked on it a lot longer than I did. I was there for about a week, so I didn't get to experience all the fun that these folks had. But after talking to them, I realized, hey, this is a much longer episode than 15 minutes. And honestly, the Great Movie Ride, once the flagship attraction at the Disney MGM Studios, and then eventually, of course, Disney's Hollywood Studios, this needs more attention. It needs a bigger platform on the show. So here we are with episode number 201. And again, I had a very different way that I was going to tell this story. It was going to be like a Word of the Week, all facts, all open and closing dates, blah, blah, blah. But the more I heard from friends, the more I heard about the really cool, unique stuff and unique experiences that so many cast members had while working on the Great Movie Ride. And I just had to include those in this episode as well. So this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to have the beginning of the show. We're going to do the nuts and bolts of the Great Movie Ride. I'm going to tell you why it was so great. I'm going to give you some history. And then in the second half of the episode, I'm going to delve into those stories and those Easter eggs and those little nuggets and factoids that friends told me, who will remain anonymous, by the way. Yeah, these are the unnamed sources, right? You know how in sports, an unnamed source will come out? Like a pitcher will have a horrible game, like an ace, right? Like the best pitcher on their team will pitch just a terrible game. And an unnamed source in the clubhouse will tell the media that that pitcher was eating fried chicken in the clubhouse the day before, or playing a video game, or sometimes it's the quarterback and his wide receiver throws him under the bus and says he's not a team player. Listen, these are things that I've had to deal with in my city of Philadelphia. But just like those unnamed sources, these sources that had worked on the Great Movie Ride will remain anonymous and unnamed to protect the, well, somewhat innocent, but to actually protect the current cast members. All right, so starting off the talk about the Great Movie Ride, I wanted to mention something that you might, maybe you know, but you might not know. And that's about CB. So when the tour guide, like I did at the beginning of the show, when the tour guide would say, ready when you are, CB, that tour guide cast member was actually referring to or talking to Cecil B. DeMille. And Cecil B. DeMille was a legendary filmmaker of over 70 films. So if you haven't heard of him, that is the CB that the tour guide was referring to at the beginning of the attraction. Anyway, that's your first tidbit right there. That's the first knowledge drop I'm laying on you right here, dropping bombs on the Ear to There Disney podcast. As Eminem would say, I came to drop bombs. Anyway, so the idea for the Great Movie Ride goes back, believe it or not, all the way to the days of Walt Disney. Of course, maybe not in the incarnation that we eventually got at the Disney MGM Studios, but in the 1950s when Walt was building Disneyland, Universal Studios was already successful with allowing paying guests, paying customers to come in and see the studio. That went back all the way to 1915 when guests would pay 25 cents to sit on bleachers and watch things get filmed. And in 1964, they introduced their first ever trams. So Walt was always trying to innovate and do new things, but he was also trying and wanted to keep up with the Joneses. In the 50s, when he was actually trying to build Disneyland, he thought about building his park across the studio, across the street, right there across from his studios in Burbank. But there just wasn't enough room and the land was too expensive. So that's why he eventually settled on building Anaheim and Disneyland. So in the 60s, when Universal came out with their tram tour, Walt had wanted to create his own tram, his own tour of the movie studios. But of course, Walt passed away in 1966, and that idea was shelved for a while. Then, about 2 decades later, a team of Disney Imagineers led by Marty Sklar and Randy Bright, they were given the assignment of creating 2 new pavilions in Future World in Epcot. The 2 pavilions that these Imagineers came up with were the Wonders of Life Pavilion, which would include a bunch of attractions that explored the mysteries of biology, and the Great Movie Ride Pavilion, which was designed to give guests an insider's look at the magic of film. Now, this pavilion was originally going to be built between the Land and the Journey into Imagination pavilions. It was designed to look like a movie set backdrop with a ticket booth as the entrance and a soundstage background. So the concept of this pavilion was that guests wouldn't only get to see a film being created, but they would also get to experience it. They would get to live it. And a big part of that was that the pavilion would show the guests the falseness, the fakeness of Hollywood. So what looked like a big cityscape would in fact just be a backdrop of cardboard cutouts, or what maybe looked like an AT-AT would have scaffolding up behind it. Sounds familiar, right? So the CEO of the Disney company at the time was Michael Eisner. And Michael Eisner came from a movie-making background. So not only did he like the idea of the Great Movie Ride Pavilion, he loved that idea. He loved it so much, as a matter of fact, that he wanted to design not only an Epcot pavilion around that idea, no, he wanted to build an entire new theme park. Now, there's a little controversy on just why Michael Eisner wanted to open this new theme park so quickly. The story was that Universal Studios had already had talks to break ground on their new theme park in Orlando in 1986. So the Disney company and Eisner rushed to break ground in 1986 as well. Originally, the Disney MGM Studios was supposed to open in 1988, but the date was pushed back and it finally opened on May 1st, 1989, about a year before Universal opened its park with its backlot tour in June of 1990. So Michael Eisner and the Imagineers decided to make the Great Movie Ride the weenie, the hub, the icon of the park. And like I mentioned earlier, it was to become the flagship attraction of the park. So originally it was going to be like a nondescript building. Well, that wouldn't do, since it was going to be the weenie, since it was going to draw guests into the park from the main entrance. So they decided to replicate one of the most famous theaters in Hollywood, Grauman's Chinese Theater. Now they made it to scale, and it is almost, on the outside anyway, an exact replica of that famous theater. Disney even had famous celebrities come for the first couple of years and put their handprints and footprints in the wet cement out in front of the theater. Of course, all of the early Disney MGM Studios merchandise. That's right. Okay. Moving on. The early merchandise all featured the Grauman's Chinese Theater as the icon or as the center of the park. Well, eventually, and this is according to legend, since there's not really any news about it anywhere, Disney got into a legal dispute with the owners of Grauman's Chinese Theater in the 1990s. One of the results of that dispute was that Disney was no longer allowed to use the theater in its promotional materials. That meant commercials, guide maps, t-shirts, you name it. Disney couldn't put the Chinese Theater on it anymore. So that's why they built the Sorcerer Hat out in front of the Great Movie Ride. All right, that's a lot of background about the park itself, a little bit about the attraction. Let's go more in depth into the Great Movie Ride itself. The Great Movie Ride was the second guide wire attraction built in Walt Disney World. The first was the Universe of Energy. So like the Universe of Energy, the Great Movie Ride consisted of kind of a moving theater. Originally, there were two connected vehicles. Each one had its own tour guide, and these tour guides would operate the vehicle through the attraction. Now, these were trackless vehicles that operated on a guide wire that was under the floor. You would see the cast members moving a joystick forward and backward. Well, that was to control the speed of the attraction, but the actual turns weren't handled by the tour guide cast member or the gangster or bandit. They were handled by the attraction itself. Now, eventually, an e-stop, an emergency stop, was built into the vehicles. And if the vehicle strayed more than a half an inch from where it was supposed to be along the guide wire, the vehicle would automatically stop and a cast member would need to manually restart it. This was because in the early days of the Great Movie Ride, a tour guide had his back turned, like they often did, to the front of the vehicle so they could spiel to the guests who were riding behind them. Well, on this one particular time, if you can remember when the Great Movie Ride started, you would take a hard left, a 90-degree left, as a matter of fact, into the attraction from the load and unload area. Well, in the early days, before that stop, that electronic, The vehicle did not automatically make that turn. It went off the guide wire, crashed into the wall, and until the day that the Great Movie Ride closed, you could still see a seam on the wall from where that vehicle had crashed. So after that had happened, they installed the e-stop into the vehicles. So it would stop, the vehicles would stop if they strayed half an inch from that guide wire. We're 20 minutes into recording here. You're sitting here with me, you're listening. And the plan was, I'm going to tell you because I'm doing this on the fly. And sometimes I do this. This is the fun of podcasting, that I can kind of do what I want. My plan was to go through the entire attraction, explain to you what happened, play some sound clips, and then go back and go through it again and tell you some fun facts. But I think it's a lot better just to tell you the fun facts as we go. So I'm going to kind of virtually talk us through the attraction. And then as I get to some spots that have fun facts, I'll tell you about them. Sound good? Good. To be honest, you don't have a say. I'm doing this by myself. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope this is a good way to go. It sounds like the more logical way to do it as I'm going. So anyway, the first scene of the first genre that we come to, of course, are musicals. And of course, we came upon Footlight Parade. And our tour guide would tell us, first, let's visit some of those great Hollywood musicals, starting with the 1933 Busby Berkeley musical extravaganza, Footlight Parade, starring James Cagney, Ruby Keeler, and Dick Powell. And of course, if you go back far enough, kind of like I do, my first visit was in 1993 to Hollywood Studios, Disney MGM Studios. You remember the girls, the dancers on Footlight Parade. You remember the big pyramid, and you remember them spinning around in a circle while bubbles floated around you driving through that scene. Now, unfortunately, it was a maintenance nightmare to keep that pyramid spinning and keep those bubbles coming. So eventually both of those were stopped and lighting effects were used to kind of simulate movement and bubbles in that scene. Bummer, right? But if you ever got to see it, it was pretty cool with the bubbles and the rotating girls. So continuing through the musical genre, we next came upon a gentleman who was out in really not so nice weather.
Come on with the rain, I've a smile on my face.
Of course, that was Gene Kelly from 1952 and Singing in the Rain. A cool thing about the Gene Kelly audio animatronic figure was that Gene Kelly himself actually got to come and check it out and ride when the Great Movie Ride first opened. How cool. So, of course, the next scene you come up on is a Disney classic. Of course, this was Walt Disney's 1964 Academy Award-winning masterpiece, Mary Poppins. The two audio animatronic figures in the scene were Julie Andrews, who of course played the title role, and Dick Van Dyke, who played Bert. Then all of a sudden, the music fades. We enter a dark, dirty back alley. We hear some ambient noise and a fight from one of the windows in the apartments above our heads. As our tour guide tells us, in fact, it looks a lot like the underworld. The scene of such classic gangster films like The Public Enemy, starring one of my favorite tough guys, James Cagney.
You want to kick in what you don't. And if you don't, somebody's going to drop by here and kick your teeth out one at a time. Get me?
It's here where our journey can go one of two different ways. So you stop here at a red light in the underworld, and your ride vehicle may be, well, taken over, maybe even carjacked. I don't know if that term was around during the 1930s, 1940s gangster movies, but a gangster might just pull a gun on your tour guide. A shootout might start. There might be gunfire from across your car where this gangster starts shooting at this car that pulls up on your right-hand side. The gangster comes from your left. Your tour guide runs off scared after he or she is told by the gangster to scram. And eventually, maybe, if you're in the right scene, that gangster takes control of your ride vehicle. This is one of my favorite parts of the attraction, and this is where things really get interesting from a design perspective. Here's where Disney had two different shows and two different vehicles. So the one vehicle would go ahead of the gangster underworld scene into the next scene, which was the bandit or the bank robbery scene. The second car would stay behind and see this gangster scene. And for the next little bit, based on if you were with the gangster or with the bandit, you would get a different show. Now, in the beginning, when the Great Movie Ride opened, all of the gangsters were male, all of the bandits were female. Now, eventually that was changing. You could either have a male or female gangster or a male or female bandit take over your ride vehicle. One of my favorite parts about when the gangster would take over the vehicle is as the vehicle would come up, on either side, you would have audio animatronics. So you had one audio animatronic on your left and then two over on your right. And then the gangster, the cast member, actor gangster, was hiding up a few stairs on this little landing on your left-hand side. Now, the gangster would get the attention of your tour guide and would say, hey, you. And the tour guide would say, are you talking to me? And here's my favorite line. The gangster would say, no, I'm talking to the dame with a funny hat over there. Yeah, I'm talking to you. It's not a good accent. That's why I was never a gangster, but I love that part. So there's a few cool things about the gangster scene that I wanted to mention. Well, one thing, this concept of live actors on an attraction was pretty much invented here by Disney for the Great Movie Ride. These live actors, especially the gangster, they were supposed to look like animatronics when you first see them. So when you first saw that gangster poking his head from the stairs, you were supposed to have a second as a guest to think, wow, is that an audio animatronic figure or is that a live actor? From what I was told from my friends who worked on the attraction, gangster cast members often had to be kind of talked out of being too stiff and looking too much like an audio animatronic in that scene, because a lot of them would really do it up and kind of do the robotic movements. Anyway, this was the first attraction to use live actors along with animatronics, and other theme parks, Universal Studios down the street, eventually borrowed this idea and this technique as well. They used live actors posing as animatronics in the Terminator 2 3D show, the Poseidon's Fury attraction, and the Mummy attraction, all when they first opened. Now, the cast members who played the gangsters and the bandits had to undergo live firearms training. The guns they used during the show were actual guns that shot blanks. They also had to have their hearing checked about every 6 months to make sure there were no problems from their hearing for firing all the guns. The guns on the Great Movie Ride used 1/4 charged blanks, so they are only about a quarter of the sound you would hear from a regular gun. At least that's my understanding. If you know more about guns and blanks, please let me know. I've actually never held or fired a real gun. I know. To put that into perspective, Indiana Jones Epic Stunt Spectacular used half-charge blanks, and the old Lights Motors Action Stunt Show used actually full-charge blanks. Now, if you remember when you first enter the gangster scene, if you look up over your left shoulder into the windows of the underworld, you'll see a hidden Mickey in a window. That was not an official hidden Mickey by Disney. A gangster cast member actually went up there with a plush Mickey doll and put him in the window, making his own hidden Mickey. So if you remember the old yellow hidden Mickey books that they used to sell in the parks, those books were written by Steve Barrett. And Steve had actually included that hidden Mickey in his book. So when Disney started writing and selling their own hidden Mickey books in the parks, they removed that plush hidden Mickey and added an official hidden Mickey that looked more like Mickey from the ground floor. There was another hidden Mickey when you drove in on your left-hand side. There was a Public Enemy poster. And on the bottom left of the poster, you can see that it was covering up a Steamboat Willie poster because you saw Mickey's bright yellow shoe and a bit of his tail poking out from behind that poster. A couple more cool things about the gangster scene. One thing was that James Cagney's family came through and they saw what his audio animatronic character was wearing in the scene that he's in. You know, the open up in there, that scene, the one I played a little bit ago. So he was in street clothes in that part of the movie. So Disney made him look authentic to that part of the movie. Well, apparently his family didn't like it. They wanted him to be kind of looking debonair and like a gangster. So they actually went and got one of Cagney's actual tuxedos and gave it to Disney for them to dress his audio animatronic. So if you've seen that scene in the movie, he's not wearing a tuxedo, but for the rest of his time residing in the underworld in the Great Movie Ride, James Cagney wore a tuxedo. So of course, a tuxedo, what goes perfect with a tuxedo? Well, a top hat. Now, he didn't have a top hat, but every New Year's Eve, cast members who worked on the attraction would always decide that James Cagney needed a top hat to finish the look. Now, it was New Year's Eve because those plastic black top hats that people walk around in on New Year's Eve that you can get at the supermarket or Five Below, those were really easy to get around New Year's Eve. So every New Year's Eve, the managers at the Great Movie Ride would explain to the cast members, no one is going to put a top hat on James Cagney tonight. And without fail, almost every year at the end of the night, James Cagney would have a top hat. Now, another cool thing about the gangster scene was when the gangster called over the tour guide and the tour guide got close, there was a trash can in between them. And when a guy got closer, the trash can would start to shake and rattle, and you would hear a cat inside the can. It sounded just like this. Now, the cool thing about that cat sound is Disney's Imagineers left it in for Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway. So there is an Easter egg in Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway that has that exact vibrating, shaking can and the screaming cat. All right, now when the gangster scene ended, your gangster who probably took over the vehicle, because as the years went on, the bandit scene was actually shown less and less. And eventually they were able to actually break those two cars up into one car. So the attraction could operate with one ride vehicle running at once. They didn't need to use the two scenes any longer. And they would run mostly just gangster scenes unless the park was super crowded and you needed both gangster and bandit. Now, to be honest, that saved the park a lot of money. And it's probably why we got the Great Movie Ride, which was an expensive attraction to keep running. Cutting it down and being able to operate one vehicle at a time and only one show scene at a time was probably the reason why we still had it up until 2017. So when you left the gangster scene, your gangster/new vehicle operator would shoot the red light, the car would start moving, and he would tell his gangster audio animatronic buddies, "See us in Choich." I'm horrible at that accent. Choich. I can't even, it's funny when I try to do like the New York gangster accent, it always turns into like a Boston accent. Park the card, Harvard Yard. That's terrible. Harvard Yard. Anyway, you would go into the Old West, the Wild West, and the first two audio animatronics you would see were on your right-hand side, you would see Clint Eastwood, who was actually supposed to be Lee Marvin, but Disney and Lee Marvin's estate couldn't agree on terms, so Disney ended up going with Clint Eastwood for the Western scene instead. And on your left-hand side, you would have John Wayne. Now, Clint Eastwood's audio animatronic character didn't speak, but the Duke, well, he had something to say.
Well, that's a mighty tough territory you're heading into, Pilgrim. I'd think about turning back if I was you. That is, if you want my opinion. But I reckon you ought to do what you think is best.
Now, apparently when this attraction debuted, John Wayne was wearing an authentic John Wayne belt buckle, one that he wore in one of his films. But as you can imagine, that disappeared somehow one day, and it was replaced by a replica. So somewhere out there, remember Fievel? Somewhere out there, someone has John Wayne's original belt buckle from the Great Movie Ride. So next up was the Western scene, where one of the bandits, either Kate Durango, who was a female bandit, or Kid Carson, who was the male bandit, would come flying out of the bank doors with bags of money mid-robbery. Then one of those bandits would take over, would hijack your car if the gangster hadn't already done so. The bank robber would throw a stick of dynamite into the bank window. It would explode. That was something you really missed out on if you saw the gangster scene. The bandit explosion was really cool. There would be another little shootout, and the bandit would escape with the stolen ride vehicle. Now, from talking to the cast members that had been bandits or had been tour guides on this attraction, the way it worked was two cast members, one a tour guide and one either a bandit or a gangster, would work together. And they would be on stage for 40 minutes, off stage for 40 minutes, on stage for 40 minutes, off stage for 40 minutes, like that. From what I understand, running around backstage as a tour guide, gangster, or bandit got really tiring. And one of the other problems was that a lot of college program kids would get this job. I call them kids now. I was one of those kids, but this is a long time ago. But the college program kids would get this role, work on any attraction, be the bandit. And from what cast members have told me, they would fall asleep in the bank. Nothing like spoiling the magic a little bit, right? So the tour guide would get off the vehicle and walk up the stairs and wait for the bank robber, the bandit, to bust out of the bank. Well, sometimes it didn't happen. And the tour guide would stand there and say, I wonder where they are. Going a little deeper into the stories, apparently one or two tour guides had their noses broken over the years because as they were going to investigate the bank robbery, then the late bank robber, the late bandit, would kick the doors open a little too late. Now, again, a lot of these cast members were young 20-something college program cast members, so hopefully they didn't ruin too many shows. Hopefully yours wasn't one of the ones they slept through. All right, so after the bank robbery, after the shootout, you would move to the next room, the next scene. And of course, you would hear the narrator over the loudspeaker say, "This is Alien. You are with Sigourney Weaver aboard the spaceship Nostromo. Something has gone wrong. One by one, the crew has vanished. And somewhere in the ship, a terrifying creature waits to claim its next victim."
Warning. Remain in your vehicle. The area you are entering is extremely dangerous.
Of course, then we were greeted by the alien. First, we would see her come out of the ceiling and try to get to our vehicle. And then, of course, as we passed in the front, she came out of the right side of the wall to get those poor guests who were riding in the back. Now, one thing that was really neat about this scene was really to the naked eye, you only saw two aliens, right? Or you saw the alien twice. You saw her come from the ceiling and you saw her come from the right side. Well, there are more than that you can't really see, or there were more than that you couldn't really see without some help. So when you first entered into the alien scene, there was shredded skin. No, that's not true. You know what? I'm leaving that in. Shedded skin, not shredded skin. Like there was shredded wheat. On the spaceship Nostromo, there is shredded wheat with skim milk. I cracked myself up. No, there was a shedded skin to show that the alien was once smaller, but is now grown and is already bigger and is shedded and left that baby skin behind. And you couldn't really see it unless you had a flashlight and knew exactly where it was. There was also another one that was hidden behind some equipment. Well, actually, I guess these are all representing the same alien. The mother alien is just going and moving as you go and move through the scene. So the one you can't see behind the equipment, you just see a tail. And it's a really long, big tail. But you can't see it unless you know where it is and you have a flashlight and you're looking for it. There's also, or you can also see the alien on the computer monitors. Although it's not an actual picture, it's like in dot pixelation form. Again, you would have to be very familiar with the movie and how they were tracking the alien, but you can see it or could see it. So in reality, you would see the alien about 5 times during that scene, not just twice. And hopefully you didn't see any shredded skin. All right. The next room, the next scene that we would go into was probably my favorite scene. I'm a huge Indiana Jones fan. Love the trilogy. I know there was a 4th movie, and I don't hate it. I don't hate it like a lot of Indiana Jones fans, but to me, it's not something that's in my rotation to watch. Anyway, of course, it is the finding of the Lost Ark scene from the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. There's Indiana Jones, there's Sala, they're lifting the Ark of the Covenant. There are all the snakes everywhere. And it's just an amazing representation of that scene in the movie. Of all of the scenes, of all of the things, it's reminded me of Casablanca, of all the gin joints and all the towns in all the world. She came into this one. I think that's a quote. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you know what? Don't correct me. It's fine. But of all of the scenes on the Great Movie Ride, I think this one was so well done. It was done to scale. You could look above you in the ceiling and see the hole at the top of the tomb that Indy had just pried open with the crowbar earlier. Then they used a rope to go down into the chamber, him and Sala. One cool thing about this scene is it's one of the only scenes in the entire attraction that has the ceiling finished. The rest of the ceilings, or most of the ceilings on the attraction, were left unfinished. You could look up above the tops of the sets or the scenes and you could see scaffolding and lighting. And that was done on purpose because we, as the rider, as the guest, were supposed to see the awe and the magic in the movie being made. Remember, like we said in the beginning of the show, when this attraction was created, we were meant to step into the movies, but they were still the movies. And you're supposed to know that you are in the movies, not in reality. So that's why they are left unfinished. But for some reason, I guess to complete the scene or make it better, the ceiling in the Raiders of the Lost Ark scene was finished, was completed. Now, I'm sure you knew about this and you've seen the pictures, but if you didn't, among all of the hieroglyphics on the walls of the tomb here, and there were a lot of them, was a hieroglyphic of R2-D2 and C-3PO. Of course, that same hieroglyphic could be seen in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indy was taking the stone cover off of the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant. And you know what? Just because I've been playing a lot of sound bites from the attraction, I gotta play the Indiana Jones soundbite.
Here in Raiders of the Lost Ark, amid 1,000 deadly snakes, Indiana Jones unearths a great treasure. Will Harrison Ford escape with his discovery? And what will be your fate?
I love that. Oh, man. And what will be your fate? Beware. So then you roll into the second room in the temple in the Indiana Jones scene, and it's not actually from the film. As you roll in, you see some stairs on your right-hand side, and the stairs lead up to a big, shiny red jewel. And this is the temple of the god Anubis. And you see Anubis, you see the big jewel, and you also see a cloaked individual standing guard over the jewel. Now, your hijacker, no matter if it's the gangster or the bandit, he or she sees that jewel up there. Now, being a hijacker and a criminal, either a gangster or a bandit, they want that jewel for themselves. So they instruct your car to stay still, to nobody move or mind your P's and Q's while they go get that jewel. As they start walking up the stairs toward the jewel, there's suddenly a voice in the temple.
Halt, unbeliever. Disturb the treasure of the gods, and you shall all pay with your lives.
Of course, our hijacker totally ignores the warning, which really they probably shouldn't have. They grab the jewel. The entire area is filled with smoke. And when the smoke clears, our hijacker is gone. What remains is a skeleton holding on to that jewel. And there, waving away the smoke, is our original tour guide. And over the years, the tour guide had a few different lines that he or she said at this moment. My favorite was when they would say, "Miss me?" That just goes to show you that anything can happen in the movies. I know there were different ones later on, but they weren't as good. Anyway, you would then move on to the horror movie genre. And in the newer versions of the attraction, your newly replaced tour guide would say, "I see dead people," which I actually kind of liked. I liked when they put that line in there. That was a good one. Then, of course, the next scene we saw was the jungle home of Tarzan, portrayed by Johnny Weissmuller, with Maureen O'Sullivan as Jane.
You lovely and talented Cheetah as herself.
Now, it's rumored that the face of Jane eventually became the face of Red the Pirate on Pirates of the Caribbean. That's rumored. I've heard it from my cast member friends and other Disney nerds, but once Jane went away, once the Great Movie Ride went away, they had that mold of Jane's face. So the rumor is that that face, to save a little money, became the face of Red, the female pirate. Now, moving on, we enter a dark night scene. To our right, we see a plane starting, a propeller plane. We hear them go. We see the propellers start to twirl. And we see Humphrey Bogart saying his last goodbyes to Ingrid Bergman in the 1942 classic, and another one of my favorites, Casablanca.
Those are no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. Someday you'll understand that. He's looking at you, kid.
I don't really have any fun facts about this scene. You know what? It's a lie, actually. I have a couple. The first one was that the plane that is seen on this scene, that's too many scenes, but the plane is actually a Lockheed Electra 12A. And Disney was looking for one of these planes when they made the Great Movie Ride because they believed that was the plane that was in the scene when Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman said their goodbye. And they did eventually find a Lockheed 12A airplane. Now, here's the thing. In the film, it wasn't an actual plane. It was a small model of the Lockheed Electra 12A. And they actually had little people in the film working on the plane, and they shot it from a distance to make it look like it was a full-size plane when it wasn't. So Disney found that out and bought their own Lockheed Electra 12A from someone who was selling one, and they cut it in half. The front half was actually used on the Great Movie Ride, and the back half was installed at the Jungle Cruise in Magic Kingdom, and it's still there. So how cool is that? Another fun fact is that the estate of Ingrid Bergman, I don't know if it was Isabella Rossellini or not. Of course, that's her daughter. The estate didn't allow Disney to use Ingrid Bergman's voice, which is why you don't hear her speak in the scene on the attraction, even though she did speak in that scene in the movie. Okay, so after leaving the Casablanca scene, we're in a dark, windy tunnel. And on our left side, we see a video screen that's playing a clip from the... Well, you know what? I'll just put a clip in here.
And now, one of the most famous movie stars in one of his greatest roles, Mickey Mouse, as the Sorcerer's Apprentice in Fantasia.
When the film first came out in 1940, Walt Disney promised to add new musical sequences in the future. His nephew Roy kept that promise 60 years later with the release of Fantasia in 2000.
So this is a fun scene, and you can see Mickey as Yensid, and you feel the wind, like I said, all around you. But here's the thing, Fantasia was not supposed to be in this section of the attraction at all. This was intended to be the first of 4 straight Wizard of Oz scenes at the end, or to make up the finale of the Great Movie Ride. This scene, of course, was going to be the tornado from the Wizard of Oz that lifts Dorothy up in the house and plants the house smack down in the middle of Munchkinland, of course, on top of the Wicked Witch of the East. So imagine this, you leave the Casablanca scene, you go into that kind of wind tunnel, and instead of having just the one screen on your left-hand side, there would be 2 screens on either side of you, kind of showing clips from the film from when Dorothy was in the tornado. So you'd see Elmira Gulch on her bike riding, you'd see the cow flying by, you'd see all kinds of stuff, and it would all be in black and white, just like it was in the movie. Then when you make your way forward into Munchkinland, everything is in color. There's that big color reveal, again, like there was in the film in Wizard of Oz. And then you have the big Munchkinland scene. So moving forward, we move out of that tunnel into Munchkinland. There's a pretty big reveal, even though it wasn't the original reveal that Imagineers wanted. I mean, talk about bright colors. It's almost an exact replica of what the Munchkinland set actually was. The buildings look perfect. The figures look perfect. And as we went into the Munchkinland scene, our tour guide would say, Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore.
Was it you?
No, it was an accident. I didn't mean to kill anybody.
Well, my little pretty, I can cause accidents too.
Oh, rubbish. You have no power here. Be gone before somebody drops a house on you, too.
Very well. I'll bide my time. But just try to stay out of my way. Just try. I'll get you, my pretty. And your little dog, too.
I wonder how we get out of here. What do you folks think? Which way do we go?
Follow the yellow brick road.
Follow the yellow brick road? Now, why didn't I think of that? Sing along, folks.
This scene was amazing and one of the best in the attraction. So the Wicked Witch of the West was an A100 audio animatronic figure, a very advanced figure, and you could really see it when she moved around. Her lifelike movements, how fast she was, it was really cool. So when the Great Movie Ride closed, Disney didn't want to just throw out that audio animatronic. So I've been told, and this is not a fact, but something that I believe to be a fact, when the Great Movie Ride was shuttered, the Wicked Witch of the West audio animatronic was moved out to Disneyland. And that figure, well, at least the moving parts underneath the exterior, the interior robotics of that figure are still used right now because that particular figure went out to Disneyland and was installed at Pirates of the Caribbean and is actually Red the Pirate. I had mentioned earlier that Jane's face most likely went on to become Red's face. Well, if you look at the figure in the scene, she moves around a lot like the Wicked Witch of the West once did. She's also clutching a bottle in her left hand, just like the witch was clutching a broom in her left hand. Listen, Disney doesn't throw out the good stuff. You might not be able to find the Wicked Witch of the West someday on eBay. So what about the Red the Pirate on Pirates of the Caribbean and Magic Kingdom? Well, apparently, again, it was told to me, but I believe it to be fact. The audio animatronic figure underneath the skin of Red in Magic Kingdom was actually once a president. Yes, it was actually at one time the audio animatronic for President George W. Bush. That is a fun fact right there. All right, so this scene was awesome, as we all remember. So as we're all singing, follow the yellow brick road, follow the yellow brick road, follow the yellow brick road, follow the yellow brick road. And then it becomes, we're off to see the wizard. All right, enough of me singing. That's not why he signed on. Although maybe it is. Listen, I've been known to record a tune from time to time. All right, it's ridiculous. So we move out of that room, and now we're officially in our second Wizard of Oz scene. But what should have been already our third Wizard of Oz scene if there were no changes made. And I didn't mention, so let me explain. When Imagineers designed the attraction, as I said earlier, there were going to be 4 Wizard of Oz scenes that ended it. So first was the tornado scene, then the awesome Munchkin Land scene, then this one.
At last! Beautiful, isn't it? Just like I knew it would be. He really must be a wonderful wizard to live in a city like that.
Ain't it the truth? Ain't it the truth?
Look, Emerald City is closer and prettier than ever. Oh, Toto, we'll be home in time for supper.
In another hour, I'll be king of the forest. Long live the king.
And then after this scene, there was going to be a 4th and final Wizard of Oz scene. But here's the problem. MGM had only licensed the rights for about 3 minutes of audio from the Wizard of Oz. This included the Munchkins singing Follow the Yellow Brick Road, the Wicked Witch's dialogue, and Dorothy's dialogue when seeing the Emerald City in the clip that I just played. That was it. So Disney was kind of stuck. They were either unable to buy the rights from MGM to play more audio, or they didn't want to pay for the rights from MGM to play more audio. That I wasn't able to corroborate either way, but it was one of the two. And it kind of put a damper on Disney's actual finale that they wanted to use. See, what they were originally going to do was both vehicles were going to pull into that big room where the screen played a movie montage, but that wasn't the plan. The plan was you would go deeper into Emerald City, and you would actually be at the Wizard of Oz's, I guess, lair, castle, office, home office, whatever that was. You know, the room with the big floating head, the great and powerful Oz has spoken. That room. So as viewers or as guests, you would pull in, there would be the floating head of the mysterious and powerful Wizard of Oz. And eventually the curtain would be pulled back and the real wizard would be there. The old man, Professor Marvel, whatever you want to call him. Now, I'm not quite sure if they had planned to do this with an audio animatronic. I'm assuming they did, but since they didn't have the audio or the music, they couldn't do it. Another even earlier concept for the finale of the attraction was the vehicles would enter that same dark room, and then it would light up all around the room, and guests would come face to face with a whole bunch of audio animatronic characters. Now, these characters were going to be some of the best in the history of cinema. So we're going to have Mary Poppins, R2-D2 and C-3PO, Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara, Rocky Balboa, the Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones. All of a sudden, this list feels very 80s heavy. George C. Scott as General Patton, Liza Minnelli as Sally Bowles from Cabaret, Gene Kelly as Don Lockwood from Singing in the Rain, John Wayne, Shirley Temple, and Mickey Mouse. Now, that concept didn't get past the concept art sketches, but there actually was still a time later in the development of the attraction where Imagineers wanted a similar type of finale with a reoccurrence or a reappearance of all of the audio animatronics you had seen on your journey. And you would see them. You would see Indiana Jones. You would see James Cagney, Judy Garland as Dorothy. They would all surround the vehicle and take a final bow as you drove through. Of course, again, that never happened. I don't know if that was due to cost or due to the rights or what, but eventually the Imagineers settled on the huge screen and the film montage that we eventually, did I say eventually twice? Sorry. So we ended up with the film montage as the actual finale. All right, so I tried to fit all my cool and fun facts in as we went along, but some of them I just couldn't fit into the story as we went, so I am going to tell you the ones that I missed now. So this is a cool one. The actual linear ride path of the attraction was 1,926 feet exactly. That wasn't a coincidence. 1926 was the year that construction began on Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood. So I also mentioned that this was a guide wire attraction. So it's trackless, but there's actually a guide wire under the ground that the vehicles follow. This was the second vehicle, or the second attraction that had that technology, but there were a bunch that followed, including the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror in Hollywood Studios. So if you've ridden the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror in Hollywood Studios, you're saying, well, you just go up and down. Well, there's also a scene where you go into the fifth dimension. You go up and then your vehicle all of a sudden drives out of that elevator shaft across the building into another shaft where it drops. Well, that fifth dimension scene is all done via guide wire. So when Walt Disney Imagineering built the Tower of Terror attractions in the other locations, including Disneyland, they omitted that fifth dimension guide wire scene. Now, it was rumored for years that that was omitted because of cost, because it would just cost too much money to build it, but that's not true. It actually was reliability. See, that scene has had lots of problems over the years, and Disney simply didn't want to put that problem into new parks, so that's why the rest of the tower attractions were built without that scene. This guide wire attraction was also a precursor to Rise of the Resistance, which is also a trackless guide wire attraction. Another thing I found in doing the research for this was that a lot of guests have the idea or memory that the Wicked Witch was once played by a real actress in the Wizard of Oz Munchkinland scene. That's not true. It was always an audio animatronic, but the audio animatronic was so lifelike and realistic that a lot of guests just swore it had to be a real person. But like I said, she never was. Now, back in the day when the attraction first opened, and actually, this is for several years until they started running just one car. Anyway, there were 5 acting cast members working at one time. So there were 2 pairs, one tour guide, one gangster, and then another tour guide and a bandit. And then there was a 5th guy who was there, a 5th cast member, who was there just in case something happened, because it was a very physical and physically demanding role. So the 5th guy was there just in case something happened to one of the other cast members. Like I said, they would work 40 minutes on, 40 minutes off. And it was during the off time, and this is one of my favorite stories, that a cast member named Dean Scholl would work on movie scripts. So he kept writing and writing 40 minutes at a time. And he eventually moved to Hollywood and sold one of those scripts to a studio. That studio made the movie, and that movie was Waiting, starring Ryan Reynolds, Anna Faris, Justin Long, and a bunch of other actors you would recognize. So how cool is that, that during a cast member's downtime, while waiting to be a gangster on the Great Movie Ride, he actually wrote a movie. And that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Ear to There Disney podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Listen, I love the Great Movie Ride. I know so many people did. So I really wanted to do this episode, and I hope I did the attraction justice. Listen, it does really mean so much to so many people. So again, thank you so much for listening. And if you did enjoy the episode, do me a favor, tell someone about it. There's got to be someone besides you in your life that's a huge Great Movie Ride fan that misses it. Tell them, hey, listen, I have a great podcast for you. Here you go. And just remember, there will be a new episode of the Ear to There Disney podcast next week. So until next time, have an amazing week. I hope you and your family and your friends are doing well. Thank you so much again for listening. Bye-bye.
Ear to there, ear to there.
Problem, officer? I would like to run off with that with
We're not in Kansas anymore. Hello, gorgeous.
I want you to go.
Ear to there.